One of the most important questions in the metaphysics of modality is whether or not there are any strong necessities. In this talk, I'm not going to answer this question, but what I will do is show that the answer, whatever it may be, must be an a priori truth. So either it's a priori true that there are strong necessities, or it's an a priori truth that there are none. I'll show that there is no coherent middle ground in which both of these prima facie possibilities are coherent options, but one of them happens to be true. The talk will be in three parts. First of all, I'll explain the background to the issue and why it's important. I'll also define a few technical terms. Secondly, I'll explain the current state of the debate, what the current dialectic looks like and how I intend to move it forwards. Third and finally, I'll set out my argument for why the truth of the matter, whatever it may be, must be a priori. So the first thing we need to understand is the view of modality that has traditionally held sway, namely modal rationalism. Modal rationalism, in simple terms, is the view that conceivability entails possibility. More precisely, it's the claim that for all propositions P, if it's ideally conceivable that P, then it's metaphysically possible that P. Now there's a couple of terms there that need defining. By ideal conceivability, I mean that some proposition P is conceivable from the point of view of an idealised rational thinker, of unlimited power and who never makes any mistakes in their reasoning, a sort of godlike mind. So there will be plenty of things that are conceivable to such a being that are beyond the conception of mere humans, such as myself. Similarly, there'll be plenty of things that seem to me to be conceivable, such as, to take an example, the idea that the square root of 2 is rational, but which, upon closer rational inspection, turn out not to be coherent. So in this case, we would say that something is merely prima facie conceivable, but that it's not ideally conceivable. The second thing we need to talk about is metaphysical possibility. In this context, something is metaphysically possible just if it's possible in the most fundamental real sense that there is. Metaphysical possibility is also sometimes called unrestricted possibility or possibility simpliciter, and thus it contrasts with more restricted notions such as causal or physical possibility. Why is this important? Well, because if modal rationalism is true, if ideal conceivability does entail metaphysical possibility, then this would allow us to map the space of possible worlds by means of pure rational reflection alone. The most famous recent instance of applying this principle is, of course, David Chalmers's recent zombie or conceivability argument against physicalism with respect to consciousness. But is modal rationalism true? Since the 1970s and the work of Saul Kripke, the philosophical consensus has been that it is not. The reason for this is that it's widely held that there are such things as a posteriori necessities. What's an a posteriori necessity? Well, it's a proposition that is necessarily true. So it's true in all metaphysically possible worlds. But its truth cannot be known by pure rational reflection alone. It can't be known a priori, it can only be known a posteriori, that is, on the basis of some empirical evidence. Alleged examples of a posteriori necessities include that water is H2O and that Hesperus is phosphorus. These propositions, or so the argument goes, are necessarily true. They're true in all possible worlds because they express identities, and identities are necessary. However, they can't be known to be true a priori. We need chemistry or astronomy to know that they're the case. We need to rely on empirical evidence. So they can only be known a posteriori. Hence they are a posteriori necessities. Now, why is this a problem for modal rationalism? Well, let's suppose that these propositions, or others like them, are indeed a posteriori and necessary. Take the negation of any such proposition. Now, by definition, the negation of any such proposition is metaphysically impossible. There's no possible world in which it's true. But the negation of an a posteriori necessity is by definition conceivably true. We can't rule it out by a priori reasoning alone. So the negation of an a posteriori necessity will give an example of where we have something that's ideally conceivable but not metaphysically possible. Hence the existence of any such proposition would refute conclusively the doctrine of modal rationalism. So what does the current debate look like? Well, of course, modal rationalists such as David Chalmers and Frank Jackson don't take this lying down. They argue that the standard examples of a posteriori necessity are not really compelling. The argument they use relies on a theory of meaning known as two-dimensional semantics. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this here, but the upshot of it as David Chalmers and Frank Jackson and others argue, is that the standard examples of alleged a posteriori necessity are in fact ambiguous, and they trade on this ambiguity. So, according to the modal rationalists, the standard examples have a sense in which they're necessarily true, and they have a sense in which they're only knowable a posteriori, but what they don't have is a single unambiguous sense in which they are both necessary and a posteriori, and therefore they don't really count against modal rationalism. Now, of course, that's not the end of the matter either. Supporters of the current orthodoxy, modal anti-rationalists if you will, argue that even if we accept in principle the deflationary two-dimensional analysis of Chalmers and others, this only applies in certain cases. So modal anti-rationalists such as David Papineau, for example, claim that the examples that can be analysed in this way are only weak a posteriori necessities because they have an ambiguity. They then claim that there are certain other cases that are, in the jargon, strong a posteriori necessities. Because they don't contain any such ambiguity, they have a single unambiguous sense in which they are both necessarily true and also only knowable a posteriori. So the exam question becomes, are there strong necessities? Various examples of these, or alleged examples, have been proposed in the literature, and incidentally, it's not clear that Kripke himself is a proponent of the orthodoxy that's often upheld in his name. But nonetheless, many philosophers such as Papineau and others have suggested that there are strong necessities. Examples include essential properties of individuals, certain statements involving indexical truths, certain truths involving metaphysical supervenience, necessary objects, and undecidable mathematical propositions. So there are these various cases that have been proposed in the literature and argued over. I tend to think of this dialectic, at least from the point of view of modal rationalists, as being like a sort of game of metaphysical whack-a-mole. So imagine modal anti-rationalists propose an alleged example of a strong necessity, then the modal rationalists have to show why it's nothing of the sort, another example is proposed, and so it goes on. And in this dialectic, the modal rationalists are always on the defensive. They have to defeat every single alleged example of strong necessity that is proposed. But the modal anti-rationalists only have to prove that one example, or one alleged example, is genuine and incontrovertible, and they win. They've proved that modal rationalism is false. So, how can we move this dialectic on? Now, I confess that I'm not neutral on this issue. I think that modal rationalism is true and that the current orthodoxy against it is mistaken. David Chalmers has some arguments to this effect. So he claims that the denial of modal rationalism involves a theory of modal space that he terms modal dualism, and that modal dualism posits an unnecessary complexity in the fundamental space of possible worlds, and that actually we can account for all of the incontrovertible moral data using modal rationalism and his two-dimensional theory of meaning. Now, as it happens, I agree with these arguments, but what I want to do is go a bit further, because Chalmers' argument, as far as it goes, is fine, but what it doesn't do is prove the negative that there are no strong a posteriori necessities. In effect, it gives a hostage to fortune, and if even one incontrovertible example were discovered, then of course it would be necessary to posit modal dualism and modal rationalism would be conclusively refuted. Ultimately, I want to prove the negative by showing that there are no strong a posteriori necessities. But I'm not going to do that in this talk. What I want to do is establish the preliminary claim that either it's an a priori truth that there are strong necessities, or it's an a priori truth that there are none. So we start with the following truism. Either A, there are strong necessities, or B, there are no strong necessities, but not both. Now, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that B is true, that there are no strong necessities. If this were true, what sort of truth would it be? Well, the first thing we can say is that it would have to be a necessary truth, because it's a truth about the space of possible worlds. Therefore, it makes no sense to suppose that it might be true in some worlds and false in others. So it can't be contingently true. It must be a necessary truth, if true at all. Well, if it's a necessary truth, then the question is, what sort of necessity would it be? And clearly, it can't be an a posteriori necessity on pain of being self-refuting. Clearly, it can't be a strong necessity that there are no strong necessities. So therefore, it's fairly easy to see that if it's true that there are no strong necessities, then this must be an a priori truth. So now we have the following slightly different version of the disjunction. Either A, there are strong necessities, or B star, it is an a priori truth that there are no strong necessities. Now furthermore, this disjunction itself is an a priori truth because I've just shown it to be true by the use of pure reasoning without recourse to any empirical evidence. Okay, now let's consider B star. And let's suppose for the sake of argument that B star is false. That is, it is not a priori that there are no strong necessities. What sort of truth would it be that B star were false? So we can see that for any proposition P, if it's not a priori true that P, then it's going to be a priori that it's not a priori true that P. Why so? Well, because if it's not a priori that P, this just means that it's ideally conceivable that not P. And it's going to be a priori, from the point of view of an ideal rational conceiver, that not P is conceivable. This is a slightly long-winded way of saying that if it's not a priori that P, then it's a priori that it's not a priori that P. So we've shown that if B star is false, that it's a priori that B star is false. And therefore now we have the following. If A is true, then B star is false. But if B star is false, then it's a priori that B star is false. And since the entire disjunction is itself a priori, this means that if A is true, then it's a priori that A is true. So now we have the third version of the disjunction, as you can see. Either A star, it is a priori that there are strong necessities, or B star, it's a priori that there are no strong necessities. This is what we were after. This is the result we were seeking to prove. And what it boils down to really is quite simple. At face value, it might seem like both of the following are coherent possibilities. Either there are strong necessities or there are no strong necessities, and that it's maybe a matter of chance or empirical facts as to which happens to be true. But if I'm right, what I've shown is that that isn't the case, that one of these must be an a priori truth, one of them must be an a priori falsehood. So which side is right? Well, in principle, you could run the argument either way. So a modal rationalist could say, well, modal rationalism isn't incoherent, and therefore it must be an a priori truth. But on the other hand, a supporter of the orthodoxy, a strong necessitarian, could say, well, the idea of strong necessities itself is not incoherent, and therefore it must be an a priori truth that there are some strong necessities. For now, I'm going to leave this option open, and all I will say in conclusion is that hopefully what I've done is shown that one or other of these options must be a priori true, and the other one is going to be incoherent. There is no middle ground in which both of the options are coherent possibilities, but one of them merely happens to be true. And I leave you to work out for yourselves ultimately which is correct. Well, thank you very much for watching my short talk. I'll be happy to address any questions, criticisms, comments you might have in the comments below, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the joint session.